First guest today is Dr. Pierre Kory. He's a pulmonary critical care medicine specialist and former associate professor in chief of the critical care service at the University of Wisconsin. He's also the president and chief medical officer of the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance and the author of the recently published book, The War on Ivermectin, the medicine that saved millions and could have ended the pandemic. That's quite a title. Please welcome to the show, back to the show, Dr. Pierre Kory.
Hey, Jimmy, thanks for having me.
It's great to see you. Now, I haven't gotten a chance to read the book. I can't wait to read the book. There's a foreword by Del Bigtree. You wrote it with Jenna McCarthy. So tell me, what is the war on ivermectin? You know, let me just tell people how I got introduced to ivermectin. So I was told it was horse paste like everyone else, and that it was poisonous if you took it as a human, and you were nuts and you were a redneck and a hick and a trumper if you thought it worked and or even took it. Now, when I got vaccine injured, I got launched into a study that they were trying to figure out how to treat people who had long COVID and vaccine injury. And one of the drugs they gave me was ivermectin, and I pushed back on the doctor, and he explained to me that this was a medicine that had been prescribed billions of times already, and it's very safe. And in fact, before COVID, they were looking at it to cure cancer. It's a wonder drug in medicine, and that the reason why they were poo-pooing it so hard was because on the off chance ivermectin could treat COVID, that they couldn't get their emergency use authorization for the vaccine, and then they would lose all that money. So that was the first big tip off to me that we were being lied to about COVID policies. So now you take it from there.
Yeah, I think you covered it, Jimmy, but now I'll go in a little more depth. But
okay.
So the book really it's partly autobiographical around COVID, a little bit of my former career, because I was quite successful in my former career until ivermectin came along. But because myself and my organization, we were involved in a number of issues around COVID and COVID policy and fighting really policies devoid from science. But, the core of the book is, I think of it almost as a very highly documented and referenced case study of a disinformation campaign on a repurposed drug. And ivermectin is that example, but it's not new. These wars, I use the term war, but these disinformation campaigns have been conducted for decades around many number of off-patent cheap medicines. Ivermectin is not new. In fact, I've said before that I wrote a book called The War on Ivermectin. Someone could write the book The War on Hydroxychloroquine. I think the wars on those two drugs never before in history has had the consequences in terms of human death and disease than those two wars, because you had a global pandemic, and never, I think, has any repurposed drug held a larger threat to the objectives of and the profits of the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, Jimmy, overnight they had a market that opened up north of $100 billion if you include the vaccines, and then the pricey pharmaceuticals like Paxlovid and Molnupiravir and monoclonal antibodies. I mean, it was a massive threat. And, when myself and my colleagues identified a data signal around ivermectin, a signal that we had not even seen anything close to before, even in all the diseases I've studied. I mean, we were seeing reports from many different centers around the world, trials, as well as health ministry reports of massive reductions in hospitalization and death, time to viral clearance, and time to clinical recovery. And when I wrote my review paper and I gave a Senate testimony, Jimmy, I didn't know what was going to happen next. I actually thought it would be warmly embraced.
So can I tell you, I happened to be watching and I saw your Senate testimony, and it was the most bizarre thing I'd ever seen. So just to clear it up, you voted Democrat most of your life, correct? Yeah, you contributed to Democratic candidates. You considered yourself a good Democrat. And when you were presenting your testimony about what you had learned treating people with COVID, you being a frontline doctor actually treating people and what works and what didn't, when you sat down to give your testimony, all the Democrats got up and walked out on you, correct?
Well, it's even worse than that, Jimmy. Only one showed up. It was the ranking member, Senator Gary Peters, and he opened the meeting. Senator Johnson, who was the chair, allowed him to open with a statement. It was the most insulting thing I'd ever heard. I mean, he literally is dismissing myself and the other colleagues on the panel as some sort of political actors.
Yes.
And yeah, and like science has nothing to do with politics, or at least it shouldn't. I mean, science is science. And you know, when he did that, I was fuming. And I didn't testify for an hour later, but you know, I think part of the reason why that testimony went viral is because I was really offended and I was really angry. And I'd worked so hard since even before COVID hit our shores. I immersed myself in learning about this disease and how to treat it. And then this guy just insults me and then walks out. No other Democrat showed up. He was the only one. He said his statement and walked out.
And he made it into a political argument. The thing that they claim that the skeptics of the COVID narrative made it political. They actually were the ones who did it. You were presenting science and data, and you were saying, it's not my word, it's the data. Look at the data. Just take a look at, you just wanted them to look at the data, correct?
Absolutely. And, you know, I really did have this naive view that our work and, you know, as we were going to publish that and bring that forward, I really thought it was going to change the trajectory of the pandemic. I really thought it would be accepted and globally deployed in prevention and treatment. You're laughing at me, Jimmy. It's not funny.
No, I know. I know.
I get it.
It's been such a big wake-up call for everybody, this COVID, of how absolutely corrupted the healthcare industry is, our National Health Service, the Federal Health Service, the big pharma, the medical journals themselves, the studies that they do, the way they rig the studies, and the way the FDA is totally compromised because 70% of their budget comes directly from big pharma, who they're supposed to be regulating. And then worse than that, the people who work at the FDA regulating them, when they leave the FDA, immediately go to work for those same companies and make millions of dollars. And so that's why that's why it's funny to me, because someone like you, who's smart, who's actually, you know, cured thousands of people and been a frontline doctor and treating COVID, that you were also, I don't know, want to say naive, but I guess that's the word for it, and how actually things work, and that money actually is the biggest motivator and is the one that will tell you what science says. It's the money, correct? Even in medicine.
There's no question. And here's the thing about the naivete, right? I mean, I never trusted Big Pharma. I knew they were doing some stuff. I thought it was a little bit around the edges. They might manipulate something here, suppress something there. I mean, I knew there was corruption in medicine, but I'd never seen it. And it's really what you just described, that unholy alliance of all of those factors, the high impact medical journals, the agencies, the professional societies, and then now with the media and social media, you know, it's the scope and the scale of their control is that I never, ever could have imagined. If anyone reads the book, it's a devastating description of what I saw, because after that testimony, Jimmy, you know, what I thought might happen certainly wasn't happening. In fact, the opposite happened very quickly. And it started within 2 days of the testimony. The Associated Press contacted me for an interview. We were so excited. We were like, this is how we're going to get the word out to the world. And I did that interview. I spent 20 minutes burying the reporter with all these data and trials and reports. And then the article comes out, and it's a 100% hit job. They basically don't even mention ivermectin. They lump it in with hydroxychloroquine. They describe the death of 2 people who took fish cleaner with chloroquine in it. I mean, it was disgusting. And that was within 2 days, Jimmy. I didn't know what the rest of my life was going to look like, but that's the first thing that happened. And then, you know, what I do in the book is I detail all of the actions, because I got put into a front row seat to this disinformation campaign. I had to look at lies. You know, when you talk about me being old liberal, I was a religious New York Times reader. I mean, I read the New York Times. That was the paper of record, Jimmy. Mm-hmm. It's the arbiter of truth. If you want to know what's really going on, you read the New York Times.
All the news that fits to print. That's fit to print.
And then I had to start seeing lies in sources of information that I'd long trusted. And I saw brazen lies being repeated in narratives. And that's when I started learning about narratives. Now I see narratives in lots of other topics that are non-medical, but you know, it was really an education, and it transformed me, I think, intellectually, politically. As a doctor, I'm kind of almost estranged from medicine from what I know about it now. It's, you know, it's been really quite a journey, and I detail that journey in the book. And I want to sort of drill on one thing that you mentioned, because for me, out of all of the corruption and control that I saw being exerted to bury the evidence of efficacy of this and distort it, is the root of it all occurred at the level of the medical journals and what I call the big six. There's a chapter in there which I call the big six, because there was really six large, I'm going to use air quotes, high quality, rigorous trials. These were the trials that were done to finally prove that it's effective, right? Because all the other trials they dismiss, low quality, too small, all of this. Everything is insufficient evidence, right? And
so you're saying there are lots of studies that show ivermectin's effectiveness, but they all dismiss those studies as not being high-powered enough, didn't have enough people, or for some other reason they dismissed them. But now you are going to have the definitive test done, correct?
And that's exactly right. So there are right now 96 controlled trials of ivermectin from all around the world, 123,000 patients. When you summarize that data, it's this immense signal of benefit. Yet, everything was dismissed and ignored. And that's what they do. By the way, this is a very common tactic. The heads, the leaders will say the evidence is insufficient. No one has ever defined for me what sufficient evidence is. So for instance, Paxlovid, the government literally signs a contract, buys billions of dollars worth of Paxlovid on a trial which we didn't even see yet. It was a press release. Actually, that was also remdesivir. You remember the famous Fauci press conference? Literally, the country went all in on remdesivir on a fraudulent trial that they manipulated. Anyway, so, you get how it's gone. So everything's insufficient evidence. So then they say, finally, they look at these big trials. And these big trials, it was so brazen how they manipulated. By the way, they couldn't bury the evidence of efficacy completely. All they had to do is bring it under the level of statistical significance. And the actions that they had to resort to do that were so incredibly, not only brazen, but they were pulling stuff that I hadn't seen them pull before. Like, for instance, our own country, the NIH trial, which is called Active 6. In that trial, Jimmy, check this out. They write the protocol for the trial that they're going to measure the difference in symptoms at day 14. Day 14. That was the original protocol for the trial. In the middle of the trial, suddenly they changed the protocol to measuring the difference at day 28. And in the paper, you can see that at day 14, there's a very highly statistically significant benefit. But how is that study written up? How is the abstract written? That there's no role for ivermectin in the treatment of COVID-19. You could see in the trial that it worked at day 14. And by the way, it was still better at day 28, just under the level of statistics. The bigger point about that, so when I said that the root of it all was really the corruption of the trials, but these trials sailed to publication in the top medical journals in the world. And if I had done that in a trial, rejected within minutes. I could have never published a study where I literally moved the goalpost in the middle. It's brazen fraud. So the NIH literally hires investigators. By the way, this is a very common disinformation tactic. It's called in an article called the Disinformation Playbook, which is really kind of structures my book, because the Disinformation Playbook, you can Google it. It outlines the 5 tactics, and they're named after American football plays: the fake, the fix, the screen, the diversion, and the blitz. The blitz is where they go after scientists. Hi there. I've lost 3 jobs, and I've left academic medicine as a result of this. But the fake is they design trials with predetermined results. So they can design a trial to show something that works. They can design a trial to show something that doesn't. And when you can see this, so openly, you can literally see it in the paper, and yet no one pays attention. The other big thing, so that there's many unholy alliances that control science right now, but the really important thing about those high impact journals is they're the only ones that drive headlines. And when I saw those trials getting published, and the other really kind of unsettling thing, Jimmy, is they were publishing these trials in what looked to me like spaced out intervals. You'd see one in February and then in May. So every time ivermectin interest or, other studies came out on ivermectin, they would publish one of these trials. And in the high impact journals, you saw waves of headlines around the world. Large study says finds ivermectin ineffective, right? And then it makes me look like a fool, right? Because here I am trying to give guidance, And I'm getting the science wrong, Jimmy. I'm getting the science wrong. And so each one of those days that they were published were like PR nightmares for me and my colleagues. And, you know, because it wasn't true. It was lies. And we were trying to fight for the truth here. And, so I'm going to finish what I just said, Jimmy, by saying, like, you know, that thing about corruption, you know, I knew it was there. I just couldn't believe how powerful it was and how they literally controlled all of the institutions of the field that I work and practice in, which is medicine. And so now, like, I can't really believe medical literature anymore, especially, you know, the conflicts of interest. Oh, the other thing about those big six. So I detail all the shenanigans they pulled. Like, quite a few of them were in South American places where ivermectin was over the counter. Tons of people were using it. They made very sure to not work that hard at excluding people on ivermectin. So it's really hard to prove that ivermectin is better than ivermectin, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, all of those things that they did is just incredible. But
so what you're saying is they did a trial in a country where ivermectin is available over the counter and people take it all the time. And when they did their trial, they didn't exclude those people who are already taking ivermectin. They just added the general population, so it didn't look like ivermectin actually worked because the people were already taking it, right? So I hope I'm explaining it to people. I hope they understand what we just said. But I also have to say that even though that study you're talking about, that it showed that ivermectin did treat COVID at 14 days, the study said it didn't at 28 days, and that's the science. So I have to let you know you're wrong about ivermectin. It does not treat COVID because the study you're referencing even says it doesn't. So I just want to push back and let know that I don't want my YouTube channel taken down.
Thanks for that, Jimmy.
Okay.
But yeah, you know, the stuff with the trial, the ivermectin thing in the control group. I mean, you could tell that they weren't trying hard at all. I mean, it was in the protocol that they could exclude. In fact, one of the big trials, they published in the paper that it excluded anyone who had taken ivermectin within 5 days. But if actually a colleague of mine went through the history of the published protocols, originally it was 48 hours. And that's a fairly long-acting medicine. And so, you know, they were just pulling whatever they could. But, you know, the important thing is that the big six, they were unique amongst all of the early treatment trials. They were the only ones where a huge number of investigators drowning in pharmaceutical industry conflicts. I mean, all of the others was done by like well-meaning clinicians and single centers and hospitals around the world. But the big six, I mean, they literally, in fact, the NIH trial, the one that I just mentioned, the lead investigator, I'm going to mention her name, Dr. Susanna Nagy from Duke. She literally owns stock in a monoclonal antibody that was to treat Omicron. And this is at the time of Omicron. She's literally holding stock in a competitor to ivermectin, and she gets fees from Gilead with remdesivir. I mean, it's brazen. I mean, it's an absolute farce. And so, like, now I can't believe medical literature with those kind of pharmaceutical industry conflicts.
So I follow a doctor on YouTube. His name is Dr. John Campbell. He's from the UK, and he's written medical books, and he's taught nurses. He was a instructor to teach nurses how to do nursing, and so he's a pretty good source. And the same awakening has happened with him. When COVID started, he was repeating the WHO and the local health authorities' guidance, and little by little, he started to realize that they were all corrupted by money and that they were all lying. And even the medical, like the Lancet, was to his chagrin. Even the Lancet is corrupted, and they're lying and printing garbage was the words that he used, printing garbage. And so, you know, I've had people when I started to push back against the COVID narrative. I had people who worked for me would say, "Oh, you think that there's a way they can suppress every doctor in the world, Jimmy? Every doctor in the world, somehow they can get them to shut up?" Well, yes, of course they can. So can you speak to that? What would you say to somebody who said that?
So it's not that they're getting them to shut up. I mean, I think a portion they don't want to go against the grain or go against consensus, even if they do. But I would say the vast majority, it's not that they're shutting up, is that they've been disinformed. I mean, these disinformation campaigns are highly effective. I mean, doctors trust medical journals and agencies. Most doctors don't read studies critically. They might read an abstract. And so if you can publish studies, large studies in high impact journals that repeatedly conclude that ivermectin is ineffective, you literally have every advanced health economy around the world. You had the vast majority of doctors who thought it was not effective. And then when you bring in the PR campaign, which was the horse dewormer campaign, now you have the entire country viewing it as this ineffective horse dewormer and then it became political, right? Then it has to be like fringe. They called it. I started seeing newspaper articles about it being like right wing.
Yeah.
And they have to make you, anti-establishment and fringe and quack and all of these words that they would use to describe myself, my work. And, at the risk of, sounding egotistical, I mean, I was really well known in my specialty. I mean, I was one of the world pioneers in a field of critical care, which was called critical care ultrasonography. I had written a textbook that's published in 7 languages. It's in its 2nd edition. I went around the country for years teaching, my skills, and and then to see this happen, I mean, that's another one of the tactics, right? So the blitz is where they harass researchers who have inconvenient science. And if you read that article, the example they use is the NFL. Remember when the story, there's a movie made of it, right? There's a researcher who found out that these football players.
Oh, CTE.
CTE, exactly. And you see what they tried to do to that researcher. And they started publishing papers which concluded the opposite, that there is no such thing as a CTE. In fact, there's a joke that they called one journal that was totally controlled by pharma and literally by the NFL. They called it the Journal of No NFL Concussions.
So it really has shaken my faith in medicine and doctors. And I told you the story yesterday when we were talking about when I had a occipital neuralgia was one of my side effects, and I went to see a neurologist, or what is they called? I think a neurologist. What is
neurologist?
Neurologist. Cool. That's it, neurologist. And I got brain fog, so I can't think of the words. And so he didn't know anything about COVID, didn't know anything about vaccine side effects. He didn't know anything about, he said, he asked me, are you vaccinated? And I said, yes. He goes, okay, we can take our masks off then. And I was like, this guy's a moron. I had to wait 2 months to see this guy, and he's a moron. And then he assured me that my occipital neuralgia was not from the vaccine, and he encouraged me to get my booster, and I wanted to punch him in the face. That I had to wait 2 months to see him. So I have lost complete confidence. Go ahead.
No, and I think you're just giving a good example of, that doctor feels himself to be fully informed. I mean, he doesn't know anything about why you're feeling these pains, but he knows it's not the vaccine,
he knows.
Right? Because the vaccine's safe and effective. He also knows that if you're vaccinated, masks aren't necessary. Like, he knows these things very strongly, and that's why it's very I'm going to describe your interaction with him as actually kind of disturbing, right? You're going to a medical professional, you're looking for advice and guidance, and he's feeding you, he's spewing absolute untruths that are nonsensical, that don't marry what we know as the data. Now, it matches the very highly curated data and guidance that this doctor gets, but they're not informed. They think they're the most informed. And in fact, in COVID, I have hundreds of scenarios like you describe, of even worse things that doctors have told my patients. And a lot of my patients, Jimmy, they are afraid of going to the doctor. They don't want to go to a hospital anymore. I mean, it's actually quite distressing. I mean, I have a lot of people coming up to me. What do I do? What do I do? I can't go to the doctor. I don't want to go to these doctors. They're going to tell me to get boosted.
They all do. Hey, what's the number 1 cause of death in America?
I believe it's heart disease.
What's number 2?
Cancer, maybe?
Well, where does medical malpractice fall?
That's 3. Yeah. So
number 3.
It's really polypharmacy. It's considered, yes, the overuse of prescription medications is a major contributor to death. And we're the most highly prescribed country on earth. I mean, we consume, the amount of pharmaceuticals that we consume is insane. And let's talk a little bit about the scope and the scale, because that was really my discovery. And I like that you mentioned John Campbell. His work has been great, but I don't want to sound like better than him, but I was way ahead of him on some of his discoveries.
Of course. I was way ahead of him too.
Yeah, you were too. Yeah.
But anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, but you're right. So, and it was kind of interesting to me to watch a guy, come along kind of like I had. I'd just been a little faster, and also he had to be very careful. He has such a huge kind of following and audience that I think he was also probably publicly being a little bit more careful and slower than I think he probably. This is just a guess, but watching him come along, but. When you look at pharma, I mean, I think it's the third largest industry on earth, right? It's right after, I think, computers and computer peripherals or software. In the United States in 2021, the pharmaceutical industry spent $660,000 for each member of Congress in lobbying, for each member of Congress. I mean, the amount of pharmaceutical money, they run those journals, they run the trials, the academic medical centers, the funding of research, and the NIH, because you said that revolving door to me is the root of it all. I mean, if you're working for those agencies, you can leave and go into pharma and you can retire with a nice paycheck. But if your behavior while you were there is inconvenient to pharma, when you go to apply for the job, Jimmy, you think they're going to welcome you with open arms?
No, they're not. I mean, something like the last 6 heads of the FDA went right to the board of Pfizer. I mean, it's it's crazy the amount of corrupt. I mean, I try to tell people about just our government in general. They think it's regular corrupted, like, oh, Joe Biden gave his kid a no-show job on an energy board in Ukraine, or Donald Trump set his kid up with a business deal with the Saudis. That's regular corruption. I'm talking about everything they do, every bill that gets passed is only passed because of corruption. We have a $800 and something billion defense budget. That's without even counting the CIA and all the other stuff. That's about $800 billion in corruption, 100% corruption. That's all it is. And that is corporations that have hijacked our government to do their bidding, the military industrial complex and the Wall Street, and of course, Big Pharma. So every time they get together to pass a law, the whole COVID thing was corruption. Everything they did was corruption. From the lying about the where the virus came from, that was 100% corrupt. They invented the virus that caused this. So they're all mass murderers. And no one's talking. You're not going to hear that on the news because Big Pharma funds the news. When Tucker Carlson brings on RFK Jr. to explain to people, not about vaccines, but about how the Big Pharma corrupts the corporate news, they fired him immediately. And so you don't get fired in the corporate news for lying. You get promoted for lying. You get fired if you tell the truth, okay? Which is why they fired Phil Donahue when he told the truth about the Iraq War. They fired Ashley Banfield, Jesse Ventura, and now Tucker Carlson. Anybody who tells the truth about anything that has to do with our wars and foreign policy gets fired, and anybody who tells the truth about Big Pharma immediately gets fired. Anybody on the news, anyway, immediately gets fired. Hey, come see us on tour. We'll be in Baltimore, San Francisco, Huntington Beach, Rosemont, and Chicago, Las Vegas, Salt Lake City, New York City, Pottstown, Pennsylvania, Stamford, Connecticut, and more, and St. Louis. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all our tickets for all our shows.